So thanks to those colleagues, and without further ado, let's make a start. Now, the presentation itself will take around 70 minutes. There's a lot of information. Much of the information you'll already know, but I present it to you in a way that you can then use it for when you have discussions with landowners and developers as well. So bear with me if you see information and think, well, we know that's the reasoning behind it. So let's start then with the learning outcomes, and after the end of this presentation, you'll be aware of the rules and principles that underpin the small sites metric and also the ecological context. You'll understand the biodiversity net gain requirements on a small site and have an understanding of the small sites metric and how that works alongside the main metric or statutory biodiversity metric. In essence, what's the same and what's different. You'll also know the competency requirements for the small sites metric and know what needs to be done on a small site, as well as having information on where to go for additional resources. So this slide is an example of what you already know, but it's set out in a way, if you wish, that you could use to explain to small site developers or landowners. So as you know, biodiversity net gain is a statutory requirement for all non-exempt developments that they provide a minimum 10% gain in biodiversity post-development. And they do that by measurements using either the statutory biodiversity metric or for small sites where the criteria are met, the small sites metric, which is a less complex tool with its own competence requirements. Using either tool, you calculate the biodiversity unit value of the land before development, that's the baseline value, and then a second calculation in the same metric forecasts the proposed outcome, with the difference between the two calculations being the biodiversity net gain or net loss. So let's talk first of all a bit about biodiversity net gain and nature. This really is a paradigm change in planning. It puts nature to be built into design as opposed to be bolted on in the past. But biodiversity net gain, importantly, doesn't prevent development. Development is important to our economy and to economic growth, but B&G will do two things. It will move development to where it has less impact on nature, and secondly, through the 10% requirement, provide a net gain in biodiversity post-development. So what we will see through biodiversity net gain for nature are positive outcomes, but also better places for our local communities and a more consistent and transparent requirements for developers. And we'll also see through that development evidence-based positive outcomes on the net gain for biodiversity. Another step change is the legal securement of habitats and maintenance for a minimum of 30 years. And what we'll also see is integration of green infrastructure on a much larger scale into developments, and also from the early planning stage.
You've muted yourself.
Thank you. Let's just remind ourselves of how we calculate the biodiversity unit. We have the size of the habitat parcel multiplied by a score for the habitat's distinctiveness, multiplied by a score for the condition in which that habitat is in, and then multiplied by a score where appropriate for strategic significance. For the post-intervention calculation, we bring forward those baseline factors, and then we have some risk factors and multipliers for difficulty to enhance and create particular habitat types, and the temporal risk or time to target condition of those habitat types. And then for off-site interventions, we have the spatial risk multiplier, which involves the distance from any loss of habitat and its compensation. So let's have a reminder of the principles and rules that underpin the small sites metric. First of all, there are 9 principles and 3 rules, and these must be followed in order to have a valid metric. So in summary, principle 1, it needs to be completed by a competent person, and we talk about that in some detail during this presentation. A reminder that the metric doesn't override existing protections, so any consent, license, regulation, piece of paperwork that was required previously is still required, and biodiversity net gain and the metric sit alongside those, offering additional protection. Existing professional best practice still applies, and Principle 4 reminder that the metric isn't a complex ecological model, but it does offer a proxy for biodiversity, and it's designed to inform decisions. So in itself, it's not a decision-making tool, but it informs decisions through conversation around its outputs. Any intervention must be appropriate and realistic, and compensation should be both local and strategic. Indeed, the multipliers in the metric incentivize that, the local through the spatial risk multiplier, and the strategic through strategic significance multiplier. And Principle 9, no minimum habitat size ratio. For the small sites metric, there are 3 rules that must be followed. First of all, Rule 1, the trading rules must be followed, and I'll explain in detail on the next slide exactly what we mean by the trading rules. Rule 2 is that the outputs of a metric are unique and cannot be compared, and that means both in terms of the statutory biodiversity metric and the small sites metric against earlier versions, and also the habitat types, that is area, hedgerow, and watercourse. And Rule 3, that the correct tool must be used, that is the statutory biodiversity metric or the small sites metric. Now, a quick note here that where we use must in this slide deck, where you see the word must in the metric user guide, and where you see must in the gov.uk guidance, that means that it's a legal requirement. So it's a legal requirement for the trading rules to be followed and that the statutory metric is used. So let's take a look at those trading rules a bit more detail with regard to the small sites metric. So the small sites metric includes habitats that are very low, low and medium in distinctiveness, and the compensation has to be like for like or like for better. So that means where you have a loss of low distinctness habitat, you can compensate for that by means of other low distinctness habitat or any higher distinctness habitat. But where you have a loss of medium distinctness habitat, you cannot compensate for that loss by any amount of low distinctness habitat, even if you provide that in much greater volume. So medium distinctness habitat needs to be provided by compensation in the same broad habitat type or a higher distinctness habitat. A little more on Rule 2, the unique outputs. That the 3 biodiversity types within the metric are area, hedgerow and watercourse, and the 10% biodiversity net gain requirement applies to each that's present at baseline. If there are, as an example, no hedgerow or watercourse units present at baseline, so there's 0 units of hedgerow and or watercourse, then no action is required for those habitat types. But where they are present, the 10% gain is required. Due to the fact that only very low, low and medium distinct habitat types are included in the small sites metric, for watercourses, you will only see canals, culverts and ditches. And Rule 3 is a reminder that you must use the correct tool. The main metric or statutory biodiversity metric, or where criteria are met, the small sites metric. And the competency requirements differ depending on which of those tools are used. So let's start to look at a bit more detail on the statutory small sites metric, which came into statutory use on the 2nd of April of this year. It's an alternative, less complex tool to the statutory biodiversity metric and can be used when certain criteria are met, such as size. The competency requirements for use of the small sites metric are broad and site specific. In short, the competent person needs to be able to correctly identify habitats present at baseline and know the management requirements for any creation or enhancement of habitats post-development. The small sites metric has a precautionary approach with many of the values fixed, and only certain habitats and interventions are available for use. So to meet the requirements for use of the small sites metric, has to be a small site that is less than 1 hectare, and where it's a residential site of 9 dwellings or fewer, or a commercial site of floor space of 1,000 square meters or less. Once it's above 1 hectare, above 1,000 square meters, or above 10 dwellings, then the main metric has to be used. In addition, in order to use the small sites metric, there must be no priority habitats present. No, it mustn't be a statutory protected site or protected habitats present, and no European species present. In addition to that, where a site is within 500 meters of protected sites or priority habitats, the advice is that an ecologist and main metric should also be used. Indeed, if a small site meets the requirements for use of the small sites metric, the main metric is always an option. And one last point on the small sites metric, where it's required for off-site units, then the provider of the off-site units must use the main metric. So let's take a look at what's the same between the small sites metric and the statutory biodiversity metric. The 9 principles are the same. Rules 1, 2, and 3 are the same. Rule 4 only applies to the statutory biodiversity metric. That's the one where exceptional and ecological circumstances allow for deviation from methodology. The calculation of units is the same in both metrics, as is the requirement for the 10% biodiversity net gain for each habitat present at baseline. Remembering that for a metric to be valid, so that's both metrics, there must be no red boxes or flags. There will be rare occurrences where we can caveat that for the main metric where Rule 4 has been instigated, and also where the developer wishes to purchase statutory credits. That said, given that only very low, and medium distinctness habitat types are present in the small sites metric, it should be incredibly rare where a local planning authority gives permission to purchase credits on a small site. So let's look at the differences between them. So we have the statutory biodiversity metric in the middle and the small sites metric and the columns on the right. So size within the small sites metric is in square meters and meters for linear features. Distinctiveness, a reminder, just very low, and medium in the small sites metric. In terms of condition of habitat parcels, in the small sites metric, existing habitats are automated, and for creation and enhancement post-development, there are limited options. For strategic significance, there is a limited option in the small sites metric with no opportunity to select medium strategic significance. For watercourses and riparian encroachment, in the small sites metric, that's automated at no encroachment at baseline and post-intervention. And in terms of interventions more generally, in the small sites metric, they are more limited. For off-site units, the small sites metric, the off-site provider would have to use the statutory biodiversity metric. So first of all, before we start looking at the metric again, let's look at when it's not required. So one of the exemptions for biodiversity net gain is the de minimis threshold, which is 25 square meters of an on-site habitat or 5 meters of an on-site linear habitat, such as hedgerow. So when the impact on habitats on a site is below this de minimis threshold, then biodiversity net gain, the development is exempt from biodiversity net gain. So it might be that you have a large development site, but where the impact is less than 25 square meters, the de minimis threshold is reached. So an example of that is, as you see in the photograph, a hard standing or car park where the baseline is 0. So if the site is entirely classified as developed land seal surface, If it's also not within a riparian zone and doesn't contain any trees or hedgerows, then it wouldn't require a metric. But when you do require a metric, let's talk about what's needed on a small site. And again, this information is presented in a way that you could give advice to developers or landowners. So on a small site, the competent person has to identify all the habitats on the ground that are within the red line boundary. And when using the small sites metric, there's then also a requirement to upload a photo of each habitat parcel into the small sites metric. The competent person needs to complete the small sites metric to give the baseline biodiversity unit value of the land using the information that they get from point 1. Then they design their site, taking into account consideration both the mitigation hierarchy and the biodiversity net gain hierarchy, where the aim should be to achieve a minimum 10% biodiversity net gain on site. They also need to set out in a habitat management and monitoring plan how any significant on-site gains will be managed and monitored for at least 30 years. And then they need to use the same small sites metric to forecast the biodiversity unit value of the land post-development and subsequently to submit a biodiversity gain plan. Where 10% biodiversity net gain isn't delivered on site, there's the requirement to purchase off-site units or, as a last resort, statutory biodiversity credits. So you might ask the question, am I competent to use the small sites metric? Or where you've received a planning application, has it been completed by someone that you deem to be competent? Now, competency for the small sites metric is site specific. To be competent, they must have the knowledge and skills to perform the tasks that we set out on the previous slide and to complete and review small site metric calculations. And they can do that through training, qualifications, experience, or a combination of those. What they must be able to do is confidently identify all habitats that are on site and also know the management requirements for both retained and created habitats post-development. As an example of that, if there's hedgerows present on site, do they have the sufficient knowledge to know the difference between the 13 different types of hedgerow? And where there's grassland present, do they know or would they recognise if it's a higher distinctiveness? So some habitats are easily recognisable, for example, modified grassland, but would they be able to recognise if it was a higher distinctness grassland? And then we're at the stage where we're 6 months from mandatory biodiversity net gain and a few months less than that for small sites. And it could be that some people will gain competency as the years go on, or they become competent for a wider range of sites. And the suggestion is that you can do that by taking part in training and or gaining qualifications and experience. They could take courses on UK HAB. They could look at the wide range of training available from SIEM, the Chartered Institute of Ecologists and Environmental Managers. And they could take courses from the Field Studies Council, including, especially, for example, one called Surveying Habitats using UK HAB. And certainly professionals such as landscape architects and architects, using the example of the Field Studies Council course, could well become competent on a wider range of small sites following that training. So remembering that competency is site specific, what a competent person would have to look at first is what or how many habitats are present. Are they able to identify the habitats on site? And again, as a reminder, know the management requirement for both existing and proposed habitats. So some examples of competency based on that would be a landowner who's submitting a planning application for their own land. And therefore they may well be competent for their own land, but that doesn't make them competent for the land of others. A gardener might be a competent person depending on the habitat present at baseline and where they're easily recognisable and where they also know their management needs. And a landscape architect and or architect may well be competent for a wide range of small sites, but not all of them. So remembering that competency is site specific, what a person should do in terms of ensuring they're competent is confidently identify all the habitats present prior to development, but importantly, know when to engage a different competent person. For example, if they come across an unfamiliar habitat or a diverse habitat. They should also be able to check for the presence of protected sites, priority habitats, and European protected species. And where there's any doubt, it would be required to engage an ecologist if one hasn't been engaged already, where there's any risk of European protected sites. For example, a building on site, trees, ponds, or watercourse. They can do that through the Magic Maps application, where they can check the site, species, and habitat records also from the local data centre. The competent person needs to be able to create a habitat management monitoring plan for the appropriate habitat post-development, and also complete the small sites metric with reference to the guidance. But what they must also be able to do is recognise and know that they've met all legal requirements and no further advice is needed. Now, alongside the small sites metric, there is also a habitat management and monitoring plan template for small sites. This has been created by Natural England. It isn't a requirement to use the Natural England's template, but it is a suggestion. But where a habitat management and monitoring plan is required, the small sites template provided by Natural England aligns with the small sites metric, and therefore it's designed to complement that calculation tool. And there's a link at the bottom of this slide to further information and downloading the HMMP. Accompanying it is a habitat guide, and the habitat guide for the small sites metric HMMP provides descriptions of proposed habitat types and conditions. And therefore this guide can help authors prepare the habitat creation, enhancement, management and monitoring activities that are required. An example here is of the modified grassland, and information here what to aim for if they're creating or enhancing modified grassland in moderate condition. Within the habitat guide and the HMMP are all these broad habitat types for very low, and medium distinctness habitats. And at a final level of detail, this is the full list of habitats here that are available in the habitat guide. But some of you may notice that not all the habitats are present on this list. So where they're not present on this list, that means the suggestion from Natural England is that that habitat type requires more complex oversight, and therefore an ecologist should be informed. So when you're reviewing a small sites metric as an LPA, if there's a habitat type that isn't in the habitat guide, the suggestion to you would be to ask the developer to provide ecological advice. So a biodiversity gain plan is also required when on a small site and when the small sites metric is used. And as you will all know as LPAs, that document sets out how the developer will achieve their biodiversity net gain. So as well as being competent in terms of completion of the small sites metric, the competent person also needs to complete the biodiversity gain plan. Now, where a development meets all the requirements for using the small sites metric, it still has the option to use the main metric if they wish. And there's a couple of examples where it might be beneficial to a developer to use the statutory biodiversity metric. Firstly, where they're already employing an ecologist, and therefore that ecologist meets the competency standards for completing the statutory biodiversity metric. Or another reason would be where there are habitats present at baseline in poor condition, and they are being retained post-development. If they use the statutory biodiversity metric, that would allow them to enhance the condition of those retained habitats with units being provided towards their B&G. Whereas if they use the small sites metric, the condition scores are fixed. That said, it may well be that the development still meets the 10% biodiversity net gain requirement on site, even without those additional units. Also, an example of using the statutory biodiversity metric would be when you want to create a habitat that isn't in the small sites metric, so one of high or higher distinctiveness, and also where there's a watercourse present and you want flexibility on inputting encroachment. So a note now on the riparian zone and encroachment, with a reminder first of all that the riparian zone is incredibly important to the ecological health of any watercourse. For rivers, streams and canals, it's 10 metres from the top of the bank, so that's where the slope finishes, and then 10 metres horizontal for rivers, streams and canals, and 5 metres for ditches, where the simple definition of a ditch is that it's man-made as opposed to natural. A reminder here that if the red line boundary is within the riparian zone of a river or stream, because of that, the watercourse module is required, and therefore the statutory biodiversity metric must be used even on a small site, because rivers and streams are high distinctiveness and therefore not included in the small sites metric. Now, encroachment within the riparian zone is anything that's non-natural. Removing encroachment that's present at baseline provides units post-intervention. So where there's encroachment present at baseline that's going to be removed on a small site, they may be wanting to use the statutory biodiversity metric because the values in the small sites metric are fixed for encroachment. A note now on the biodiversity net gain hierarchy, and a reminder that this is statutory, including the statutory instruments, and with information within Planning Practice Guidance or PPG. And what it says is that on site, that the developer must avoid adverse effects to medium distinctness habitats in relation to the small sites metric, so high distinctness for major sites. Where there are adverse effects, this is the preferred order of compensation that must be followed. Firstly, to enhance habitats that are present on site. Secondly, to create habitats on site, and only then to provide off-site units. And then finally, as a last resort, to ask the LPA for permission to purchase statutory credit. As an LPA, where a developer is looking to purchase off-site units, you may want to query whether or not, based on the biodiversity net gain hierarchy, that everything's been done on site that could be done to provide units before going off site. But as part of that, with a small sites metric, you need to consider a triage approach, consider proportionality, risk and resource. Certainly, if you're presented with a valid metric with all the biodiversity units provided on site, it may well be that that metric is subjected to little review. Where there are off-site units, you might want to consider the amount that are relative to the baseline value. And again, give an overview of the site design. So what is it that you could be looking to see provided by developers and designers on a small site? Well, a simple answer to that is actually a surprising amount. I think we'll see over time much more green infrastructure. We'll see more swales, ponds and rain gardens, but also provided could be planting of grassland, scrub, trees and hedgerow. Developers can use buildings and structures to provide biodiversity units, and they can provide sustainable drainage systems or SUDs. Now note here that before we entered the pre-election period, we had been expecting legislation on sustainable drainage systems. I'm not aware of the priorities for that or any timeline for our new government, but it may well be that we will see future legislation on sustainable drainage systems, and therefore you may want to make that information available to developers and discuss with them about provision of SUDs on any small site. I think we'll see innovation in all of the above over time, so it would make sense for local planning authorities to keep up to date on industry developments and provision of biodiversity units on site. So let's now start talking about some individual habitats on small sites, and firstly with trees. So the guidance to developers should be that the more trees they keep on site, the smaller will be their biodiversity net gain loss, and therefore the fewer biodiversity units they'll need to achieve their 10% biodiversity net gain. Remembering that with our paradigm change in planning with biodiversity net gain, nature in terms of best practice should be built into the design of the site rather than bolted on. So therefore the suggestion is to retain those habitats such as trees on site as part of the design. Now, as you all know, tree surveys are routinely required for planning applications, and those tree surveys consider the health and amenity value of each tree, which is different to the B&G condition assessment, which uses different criteria in assessing the biodiversity value. Therefore, where there is a tree on site with low amenity value, it doesn't automatically mean that it's got a low biodiversity value. Any trees that are retained do need sufficient space both above and below ground for both their roots and their branches to grow once development is complete. And a reminder here that all garden trees must be included in the baseline that have a trunk diameter breast height of greater than 30 centimetres. So a medium tree or higher needs to be in the baseline. And that is also the case even where a tree preservation order isn't in place. Planting new trees within the development is a good way of generating biodiversity units, and therefore developers should consider planting in the public realm, incorporated along streets and in public spaces. And for guidance on provision of trees on small sites, there's a link there in the slides to a very informative blog post from the Forestry Commission. So let's look in more detail as to why developers should retain trees that are present at baseline. Firstly, the metric incentivises that retention, and therefore it's particularly important to consider retaining trees if they want to deliver all their B&G on site. Individual trees within the metric are a medium distinctness habitat, and therefore if lost at baseline, following the training rules, where compensation for medium distinctness habitat has to be the same broad habitat type, therefore compensation is only possible where there's a loss of trees by planting more trees, where you're using the small sites metric. And the bigger the tree, the greater amount of new planting. So therefore, again, reiterating this best practice advice of retaining trees as part of the design. An example here, and you see the large oak tree in the photo on the right. If that large oak tree was to be lost from the baseline of a development, then more than 20 small trees would need to be provided on site to compensate for that loss of that one large tree. Now, it's also important to have an awareness of ancient and veteran trees on small sites. Just because it's a small site doesn't mean that they won't necessarily be present. Where they are present, then the main metric must be used because they are, as you will know, they're irreplaceable habitats. So again, as you know, irreplaceable habitats, importantly, are protected from impact and loss. And their features are listed here, but they're not limited to those features. And certainly where there's a small site where the presence of ancient or veteran trees is thought to be the case, then advice should be sought from an ecologist. Now, not all veteran trees are ancient. There may be a mature or younger tree with veteran features. And again, in this case, further expertise would be required. Handily, some of these are recorded on the ancient tree inventory, and the link there on the slide. And where they are including that inventory, all well and good. but presently not all are recorded on an inventory. So just because it's not an inventory doesn't mean it's not an ancient tree. Included on the slide, though, for further information is the gov.uk link to guidance on B&G and irreplaceable habitats, and also the gov.uk advice on ancient woodland, ancient trees and veteran trees in relation to planning decisions. So let's also talk now again why we should retain woodland that's present at baseline. And again, metric incentivise retention, so therefore particularly important if they're wishing to deliver B&G on site. Most of the woodland types within the small sites metric are medium distinctiveness, although other coniferous woodland is low. So therefore, for those that are medium distinctiveness, if they're lost at baseline, compensation is only possible by creating or enhancing woodland. And the example here, if 1,000 square metres of other broadleaf woodland was lost, compensation would need to be by way of 1,750 square metres of woodland creation. And therefore, because of that, the site size and design might limit the ability to compensate for woodland, and therefore best practice advice, retain the woodland as part of the design. So just a reminder about the importance of ancient woodland on small sites. Small sites metric doesn't have the functionality to record irreplaceable habitats, and therefore the main metric needs to be used. They are protected though from impact and loss, and further expert advice should be sought where it's thought that there's ancient woodland present on a site. Again, with a small site doesn't mean that ancient woodland would not be present. And again, ancient woodland is mapped within the Magic Map application, but again, not all of it. So let's move on and talk about Hedgerow and the Hedgerow module of the metric. And again, retention is incentivized by the metric. Distinctiveness, though, is dependent on the type of hedgerow, and there's 13 different types of hedgerow within the main metric, and those of low, very low and medium distinctiveness within the small sites metric. Because it's a separate habitat type within the metric, there's a reminder that compensation for loss is therefore only possible by creating more hedgerow. If 30 metres of native hedgerow was present at baseline and lost post-development, at least 36 metres of hedgerow creation would be required in order to compensate for that loss. So let's talk now about wet habitats and retention of ponds. And again, non-priority ponds, which are medium distinctiveness, are included in the small sites metric, and there's an incentive to retain. Medium distinctiveness compensation, remember, is the same broad habitat type. So non-priority ponds are in the broad habitat type of lakes. The only other habitat types are ornamental lakes, which are low distinctiveness, so can't be used to compensate for non-priority ponds, and reservoirs, highly unlikely that you'd be compensating with a reservoir. So therefore, for a non-priority pond, compensation is only possible by creating and enhancing non-priority pond. And if you do to lose 100 square metre pond from baseline, compensation would be a pond of at least 170 square metres. A note now on the lowering of biodiversity value prior to submission of a planning application, often referred to colloquially as purposeful degradation. That is the removal of habitat prior to the application, be it filling in of ponds, removal of scrub, trees and hedgerow. As you will know, if habitat is cleared, destroyed or degraded prior to a planning application and after the 30th of January 2020, then the baseline provided as part of the application should be prior to the degradation. So if degradation happened today and an application was submitted tomorrow, then the baseline should be based on habitats that were present yesterday. But where the loss of habitat or degradation isn't known, the date can go back as far as 30th of January 2020. And the metric should use the pre-degradation habitat type as the site baseline. This may well end up penalising the developer especially where it's not known for certain the exact habitat type and condition in which it was before the degradation. So a precautionary approach needs to be taken when assigning the scores within the metric. And so unless there's evidence to the contrary, with the pre-degradation habitat, it should be assigned the highest condition, therefore good condition within the metric. There's also within a user guide in the main metric that they should also account for the time between habitat loss and compensation by using the delay in starting habitat creation or enhancement function. These functions aren't available in the small sites metric, so as the LPA you might want to consider, dependent on when degradation took place, whether or not you ask for the main metric to be used. So with all that in mind, let's look at some examples of when use of the small sites metric would be appropriate. So in this example here, we're looking at the size of the site. On the right-hand side, we've got site A, which is a little over 15,000 square meters, and site B, which is under 10,000 square meters. Site A doesn't meet the requirements for a small site, and therefore the small sites metric cannot be used. Site B, though, does meet the requirement for a small site, and the application is for 8 dwellings. It's on arable land, and therefore, because it has less than 10 dwellings, is under 10,000 square meters, and isn't priority habitat, use of the small sites metric would be appropriate in this instance. Now let's talk about location. So we have site A at the top on the right and site B at the bottom, and you'll see that site A is within 500 meters of a protected site, SSSI. And therefore, because of this proximity to that SSSI, serious consideration should be given to an appointed ecologist and therefore completing the main metric. The site B, though, it's further or it's outside the 500 meter buffer zone of the SSSI, and therefore, if all interventions are consistent with the small sites metrics limitations, again, in this instance, small sites metric use would be appropriate. We also need to consider watercourses and rivers or streams. Bearing in mind that rivers and streams are high distinctiveness habitats and not included within the small sites metric. In our examples here on the right, both site A and site B are under 10,000 square meters and are located on low distinctiveness arable land. Site A, though, falls within the riparian zone of the river Tern, and the reminder here that where the red line boundary falls within the riparian zone, the watercourse module of the metric must be used, and therefore the small sites metric can't be used because the watercourse module for rivers and streams is only available in the main metric. Site B, though, is further away, and the site falls outside the riparian zone of the river, and therefore, again, if all of the criteria are met, it would again be appropriate to use the small sites metric on this occasion. Now let's look at what habitats are on site at baseline. In the examples on the right, site A and site B, they're both less than the 10,000 square meters and are not within 500 meters of protected site. Site A is located in a patch of other neutral grassland, but also with a pond priority habitat. A pond priority habitat is a high distinctiveness pond, and therefore the small sites metric can't be used. In addition to that, if the grassland type was such that the assessor couldn't competently identify it, another reason why the small sites metric must be used and ecologists employed, and the statutory biodiversity metric. Site B, though, is land that's currently used for the production of cereal crops. Easily identifiable habitat, that is low distinctiveness. So again, if all of the criteria are met, use of the small sites metric would be appropriate in this location. We then have to consider whether or not European protected species may be present on site. So we've got 3 examples here, site A, B and C, where they're all under 10,000 square metres and are not within 500 metres of protected sites. So on that basis, a small sites metric might be appropriate. Site A, though, that we see an example image on the right, although it's modified grassland, it contains an old barn, and therefore there's potential for bats, even if there's no records from the record centre and magic maps. So because of the potential for maps, an ecologist would be required to conduct further surveys, and the suggestion here that might be that the developer avoids this site for a simpler one, or after consideration of the presence of bats, only then whether the application goes ahead. Site B and C, though, are different. Site B is on a patch of modified grassland, which is easily identifiable. It's a low distinctness habitat, and protected species surveys have been undertaken within the last survey season by an ecologist, and that survey has confirmed no presence of European protected species, even though there's an old barn on site. So again, if all of the criteria are met, the small sites metric could be used. Site C, area of bare ground, again, low distinctness habitat. Within that, the bare ground, there's no trees or structures present, and it's not within 500 metres of any pond or ditch or close to a watercourse. There's no trees and no woodland near the site. Therefore, if there's no record of European protected species, and nothing that would suggest that they would be present, again, small sites metric could be considered. So let's now take a look at an example small site. The site boundary in our example includes arable land, some developed land, private gardens, individual trees, and non-native hedgerow. The total site area is a little under 4,000 square metres, and it's a residential build that meets the small site designation of between 1 and 9 dwellings. In this example, the developers intend to replace the existing building with a series of terrace dwellings and add a biodiverse green roof. In addition, they're also going to convert the existing arable land to modified grassland and plant some hedging. The total footprint of the private garden won't be altered, and none of the habitats or interventions are deemed strategically significant. So let's take a look at it in a bit more detail. We have the baseline mapping shown top right and post-development bottom right. At the baseline, we can see the developed land seal surface that's already present, and also the vegetated garden. And we see that there's some non-cereal crop habitat parcel and an individual tree. There's also 23 metres of non-native and ornamental hedgerow at baseline, which is going to be retained. Post-development, we create modified grassland, and we also create biodiverse green roof, and we add 82 metres of hedgerow. Having done that, what we need to have considered is, first of all, whether the site was appropriate for use of the small sites metric, and given the baseline it was, that it wasn't within 500 metres of protected sites, no presence of European protected species, and the assessor could confidently identify those existing habitats on site, that is the non-cereal crops, vegetated garden and tree. Also, the site's not within a riparian zone, and the interventions were achievable with the developer's level of expertise. So from that, we have a valid metric. Remember that a valid metric has no red flags or boxes throughout it, and we see here the green boxes and green ticks signifying a valid metric. Now, what a developer needs to know if they can't deliver all their biodiversity net gain on site. So as you all know, and just a reminder here for LPAs, that if they don't deliver it all on site, then firstly, they can provide it on land that they also own by way of habitat creation or enhancement. They can purchase biodiversity units from a landowner, or as a last resort, ask you for permission to purchase statutory biodiversity credits. A reminder, though, that as the only habitat types within the small sites metric are very low, low and medium distinctiveness, all those habitats should be readily available in the market for biodiversity units. And so it should be that there's no reason for them to ask permission to purchase statutory biodiversity credits. If it's a low number of units that they're looking to purchase, it may well be that the advice given to them is to consider purchasing from habitat banks. So in terms of the market for biodiversity units, it's developing as expected, although there are some regional variations, and there are some variations with regards to habitat types. Plentiful grassland as an example, less so for habitat types such as open mosaic habitat currently, although some are being delivered in at least 2 regions of the UK, of which I'm within England, sorry, of which I'm aware. Now, there's also a number of national trading platforms, so think Zoopla or Rightmove for biodiversity units. And we see this example here with the map from Future Homes Hub, where the pie charts signify the 3 biodiversity unit types available in those locations. My advice to you as an LPA is to be as aware as you can be of habitat banks that are available within your local planning authority boundary, or landowners who are looking to enter the market for biodiversity units. Remembering, however, that in terms of the spatial risk multiplier and the incentive to deliver locally, locally means either within the local planning authority area or the national character area. But developers should be mindful of the fact that the further away that they purchase units from the development site, that there may be an additional cost because of the spatial risk multiplier. Shown on this slide is the link to national character areas that's available on gov.uk. And I give it an example on the next slide of how the two might interact, the LPA boundary and the national character area. But in terms of the multiplier, we see at the top the multiplier of 1, where it's an area habitat that's compensated for within either the local planning authority boundary or the national character area. For that same area habitats and hedgerows and lines of trees, where they compensate outside the LPA or NCA, but a neighbouring one, then the multiplier is 0.75. And when it's further away, it's 0.5, and therefore leading to twice as many units or needing to be purchased to make up the same amount of units. For intertidal habitats, the mechanics is the same, that the multiplier of 1 is where it's delivered locally, where locally means within the same marine plan area. 0.75 multiplier kicks in for a neighbouring marine plan area, and the 0.5 for further away again. For watercourse habitats, again, same mechanics, for the multiplier to be 1 within the same water body catchment area. For the 0.75 multiplier outside the water body catchment, but within the operational catchment, and then 0.5 further away. So if we look at this example here, this is a screenshot from the national character areas. And what I want you to consider on this slide, if you look sort of top left, is we've got a national character area 46, which is the fens. Next to that is 85, which is the bricks. And then on right at the top, you've got area 77, which is a Norfolk coast. So if you had a development site within the fens, local delivery in terms of the NCA would be anywhere within the fens. Neighbouring would be, as the example here, 85 to bricks, but the other neighbours as well, and therefore multiplier of 0.75. Where if they compensated on a Norfolk coast, then the multiplier would be 0.5. But we see here on the right, the local planning authority areas. And we see that the fens, as you know, is in Cambridgeshire, and therefore they could still deliver compensation in Norfolk coast, in this case as a 0.75 multiplier as a neighbouring LPA, as opposed to if they use the NCA, it would be further away and a 0.5 multiplier. And developers have the option of which to use when assigning the multiplier, and obviously whichever is in their favour, be it the LPA area or the NCA area. A quick note on statutory biodiversity credits, but I do know that you will be given a presentation from DEFRA and Natural England on statutory credits sometime soon. But just a quick reminder that in order for a developer to purchase statutory biodiversity credits, they need to ask permission from the local planning authority to do so. And they must demonstrate to you as the consenting body that sufficient units of the appropriate habitat type aren't available in the market. When they purchase the credits, they purchase 2 credits for each unit of shortfall, and there are 6 tiers of credits. And that information on the buying process and the credit prices, which are set by DEFRA, links at the bottom of the slide. A reminder though, again, I'm sorry to reiterate, but because only low and medium distinctness habitats are available in the small sites metric, the likelihood is that there'll be a plentiful supply of those biodiversity units available in the market. It might be that you advise them to approach habitat banks where it's a small amount of units, but in many instances, there shouldn't be the need to give permission to purchase statutory credits. In terms of additional information, much of this you will know, that you have there the landing page at the top to the main gov.uk website on the statutory biodiversity metric tools and guides, which includes the statutory small sites metric and its user guide. There's the DEFRA guidance on biodiversity, again, main landing page on gov.uk, and the B&G planning practice guidance, and apologies I have not updated the slide to the new name for the minister for the service taken over from Deluxe. There's also Natural England blogs about B&G and our high-level brochure, which can be provided to developers and landowners. And as you know, plentiful advice available on the Planning Advisory Service website. Saeem, Syria and Aima have produced the B&G Good Practice Principles for Development, and Natural England operates B&G customer support on behalf of DEFRA, and that email address is shown on the bottom of the slide. And that customer support is available to all, including local planning authorities, developers and landowners. So, quick review of today's training before we hand over to our Q&A. We started with an overview of biodiversity, again, key points and biodiversity units. Seems we've gone through quite a lot in this hour. We've talked about the principles and rules of the statutory small sites metric. We've talked about habitats and their management, the Natural England's habitat and management monitoring template for small sites and the habitat guide. We talked about competency being site specific for completion of the small sites metric, and the criteria that allows for the small sites metric to be used. We saw some example use of the small sites metric, as well as where a metric wouldn't need to be provided. And we've also talked about securing off-site units. So on that note, again, I'll thank you for the invitation to present, and I'll hand back to Martin for our Q&A. Thanks, Martin.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michael. A lot to get through there. You've done a great job.